Hey guys, let's settle in, because tonight we are stepping into what has to be one of history's strangest fever dreams. It's a story so full of high society disasters, perfumed scandals, and some of the worst medical advice you can imagine. It makes that argument you had in your group chat about kombucha seem like a serious academic discussion. Tonight, we're drifting into the thick, scented fog of Victorian high society, a place where the only thing more intoxicating than power was the stuff people were literally breathing in. Ether. Yes, that ether. It was the miracle party drug that tore through parlors, drawing rooms, and the trembling hands of England's very finest. Just try to picture it for a second. The most elite, buttoned up, ridiculously dressed people on the planet, all just flopping around on velvet couches, sniffing chemicals, and every now and then completely forgetting what country they were even in. We're talking about the 1800s. Your fancy dinner party could turn into an all-out rave at any moment. There wasn't a single safety label anywhere in sight. And if anyone dared to ask what on earth you were up to, you just had to say, "Oh, it's medicinal, darling." So before you get too comfortable, take a quick second to like and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying what I do here. And maybe leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now go ahead and dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, calming hum, and really get comfortable. You might even want to tuck your feet in, just in case a hallucinating baronet happens to wander by. Just pause for a moment. Have you ever really thought about what it felt like to be a Victorian aristocrat, just riding the ether train? How did ether even become the next big thing when tea and repression were already so popular? Was it actually safer than gin? Or was that just something your butler told you so you'd stop crying on the fine china? Did anyone ever spill a bottle of ether at a royal ball and accidentally invent the first indoor fog machine? And if all your neighbors were snorting some mystery vapor out of ornate glass bottles, how could you possibly tell if you were hosting a seance or just another Tuesday brunch? And with that, congratulations. You've just woken up in London in the year 1847. You're wearing about 15 pounds of formal clothing. Your doctor has the bedside manner of a hungover platypus, and someone is handing you a delicate handkerchief that's been soaked in something. Go on, take a deep breath. What's the worst that could possibly happen? Welcome to the most intoxicated chapter of high society that you never, ever learned about in school. It's time we made some introductions. You find yourself at the center of a candle-lit Victorian salon, surrounded by the scents of rose water, pomade, and so much perfume that the air itself is technically flammable. But all of a sudden, society is craving something a little stronger. Perfume is officially out. Ether is in. And everyone is about to find out what happens when your beauty routine gets replaced by chemistry. Let's really set the scene. You're swimming in a sea of frothy petticoats and stiff-collared dinner jackets, drifting through a fog of lavender, sandalwood, and hints of some mysterious animal. There's a crystal decanter of cologne sitting on the table, a dish of potpourri on every single surface, and an anxious spaniel under your feet that's already halfway high just from the fumes. For centuries, this was the Victorian solution to body odor, a problem that no amount of rose water could ever truly defeat. But at least everyone had agreed to pretend it was working, until now. Because someone, and it was probably your cousin who reads far too many French novels, has just shown up with a vial of clear liquid and the absolute conviction that tonight is the night to break with tradition. The sales pitch is simple enough. It's medicinal. Doctors are using it for everything. Just one little sniff, and your nerves will be as calm as a monk in a coma. You glance around the room. The matron over by the fire is fanning herself like she's trying to start a small engine. The local vicar is already looking interested, which really should have been your first warning sign. You've already made it through 1,000 other trends. You've choked down cod liver oil. You let a doctor attach leeches to your earlobes. And you spent 3 long months on that bathing with vinegar experiment. Nobody talks about the aftermath of that one. So why not try ether? Besides, this is a scientific age. The telegraph is a thing now. People have strong opinions about magnets. And nothing says modern quite like trusting your personal health to something you can't even pronounce. So you all gather around. The ether is poured onto a lace handkerchief, very carefully, because it evaporates faster than an aristocrat's interest in hard work. You raise the cloth to your nose, trying your best not to think about the fact that your entire social circle is about to do something that even the cat finds suspicious. There's a brief tingling cold, a strangely sweet smell, and then lift off. The world starts to get a little fuzzy around the edges. The conversation slows down to the consistency of syrup. Lady Wilmington is giggling at the wallpaper. You realize with a jolt of horror that you're also giggling, though you have absolutely no idea why. You're not even sure you know your own name anymore. And that's it. That's the start of the revolution. By midnight, the salon has turned into some kind of aromatic laboratory. Half of the guests are sprawled out on fainting couches in various states of euphoria. The other half are busy trying to pretend that this is all perfectly normal. Someone has knocked over a candle, but nobody moves to pick it up. There's a heated debate going on about whether ether is more civilized than gin, which is funny because both groups are slurring their words. This is exactly how it spreads. The next day, you'll hear all about the marvelous tranquility at Lady Dashwood's little gathering. And by the end of the week, even your most skeptical friends are sending their butlers to go fetch more bottles from the local chemist. All of a sudden, the perfume trade is in a full-blown panic. What good is lavender water when your rivals are sniffing scientific progress straight from a monogrammed flask? What's the point of musk if your nerves can only be calmed by something that smells like a hospital and deep regret? And so the great scented arms race begins. The city's perfumers are scrambling to adapt, mixing ether into their rose water, bottling up medicated mists, and creating advertisements that promise a most refreshing sensation for the busy socialite. It's only a matter of time before someone starts bottling their own mixture in a bathtub, and an entire parlor spends the night completely convinced they're floating. You can almost hear future historians just sighing. This is how the mighty fall. Not with a bang, but with a quiet snort and a cloud of vapor, surrounded by discarded perfume bottles and the lingering scent of some very, very bad ideas. And as the embers in the fireplace die down and the scent of ether hangs in the air, you realize you're witnessing the exact moment that perfume lost to progress, and progress, predictably, lost to impulse. Welcome to the revolution. Just try not to set your hair on fire. Let's talk about the first time you actually heard about ether. It wasn't from your doctor. It was from your cousin, Cordelia, who swore it was all the rage over in Paris. Within a matter of weeks, polite society is passing around little glass bottles like they're after-dinner mints. The servants are baffled, the footmen are alarmed, and the medical journals are, as usual, about 6 years behind. You remember the moment perfectly. You're sitting there, stiff-backed at a respectable London dinner, listening to some gentleman explain why railway timetables are an affront to God, when Cordelia leans over and whispers, "Have you tried the French remedy for nerves?" At first, you assume it's just another one of her teas, herbal, questionable, and always suspiciously green. But no, she pulls out a tiny vial, neatly labeled ethylic, and gives you a wink. "They're all doing it in Montmartre," she says, as if this is both a recommendation and a threat. At this point, the gatekeepers of good taste, your mother, the Duchess of Gossamer, and the entire Royal College of Physicians, are theoretically supposed to be standing guard over the boundaries of propriety. Their whole job is to prevent scandalous trends from slithering past the lace curtains and infecting the drawing room. In practice, their main defense is just looking disappointed and occasionally banning rhubarb at garden parties. They have absolutely no idea what's about to hit them. It starts small. Ether first arrives as a remedy, whispered about in sick rooms and apothecaries. Your local doctor, the same one who recently recommended powdered oyster shell for anxiety, is suddenly brandishing a bottle of this new miracle. Just a little whiff, he promises, and you'll feel as calm as a bishop on a Tuesday, all while the bottle leaks suspiciously into his coat pocket. You're told that ether is scientific, modern, and absolutely not addictive. These are technically all lies. The gatekeepers are completely unprepared. They're used to fighting off the dangers of dancing too vigorously, or eating ice cream after sunset, or reading novels without a chaperone. But ether isn't some foreign vice or a working-class problem. It arrives dressed in silk, speaking French, and crucially, it's being recommended by a doctor with an accent. Nobody can resist a prescription when it's delivered in flawless Parisian. The servants, of course, are the first to notice that something is wrong. Mrs. Bradshaw, the housekeeper, catches Lady Charlotte laughing all by herself in the conservatory, at a fern. The butler finds the youngest son trying to explain the philosophy of cheese to a dog that's just passing by. The staff all exchange glances, mutter about modern nerves, and go to double-check the locks on the liquor cabinet. Meanwhile, you're just left wondering why all of your family portraits have suddenly started to look so judgmental. In the salons, the spread is viral. No respectable hostess wants to be the last one to embrace the new trend. So ether sneaks onto every invitation list under the category of restoratives. The apothecaries are selling out completely. Chemists, who were previously known only for smelling like cabbage and secrecy, suddenly become the city's most sought-after party suppliers. All of a sudden, it's entirely possible to find yourself at a luncheon where the main course is chicken, a la king, and the dessert is a cloud of flammable vapor. And it isn't just the upper crust, either. Ether jumps across social boundaries with the agility of a cat at a fish market. Young clerks, society matrons, and even minor poets are all dabbing their handkerchiefs with the stuff, hopping for a little inspiration, or at least a break from the agony of being alive in an age of horse manure and rigid etiquette. By the time the medical journals finally publish their first warnings, some mild alarm regarding recent chemical fads, but no need for panic. Unless your vicar starts levitating, half the city is already hooked. The final blow to the gatekeepers is their own curiosity. Before long, even the most resistant members of society are slipping behind the velvet rope just to see what all the fuss is about. Your own uncle, a stern man who once banned Christmas crackers for being too boisterous, is now seen floating blissfully through the garden, muttering that the geraniums are plotting against him. That's how it happens. Not with riots or protests or in dark alleys, but with laughter behind closed doors, doctors with a strange twinkle in their eye, and the slow, delicious thrill of breaking a rule that nobody even knows exists yet. The gatekeepers never really stood a chance. Ether was in, and by the time anyone noticed, society had already forgotten what it was supposed to be guarding in the first place. The year is 1847. And science pretty much means anything that involves bubbling glass. Ether is the latest miracle, being praised by both physicians and poets. The promise is instant relief from boredom, from nerves, and from reality itself. The side effects are not mentioned in polite company. Everyone wants a taste of it, and nobody is bothering to read the fine print. Let's start with the scene. Gaslight is flickering over marble busts and overstuffed sofas, and everyone whose anyone claims to know at least a little something about chemistry. Your neighbor's cousin, who visited the British Museum one time, is now a leading authority on every single jar in the apothecary. It's the golden age of scientific optimism, a time when a white lab coat means never having to say you're sorry for exploding the kitchen. And right in the middle of all this progress, society has fallen head over heels for a substance that literally evaporates if you leave the lid off for too long. For the Victorian upper crust, ether isn't just a medicine, it's a sensation. There's a delicious thrill to the idea that you, a respectable person in a starched collar, might inhale something that makes you forget which fork to use at supper. In a world where even laughing can be dangerous if it rattles the china, ether is the ticket to some temporary anarchy. It's rebellion, but with excellent posture. The scientific establishment, never ones to let a good bandwagon roll by without jumping on, are quick to endorse ether. Medical journals are churning out enthusiastic reports. A most peculiar calm was observed in the patient following inhalation, which was followed by hysterical laughter and some spontaneous waltzing. Surgeons, eager to be on the cutting edge of things, start using it in their procedures. The results are mixed. Some patients wake up marveling at the wonders of modern medicine. Others wake up convinced they've just been chased by a flock of ghostly sheep. Meanwhile, back in the drawing rooms, everyone is a budding scientist. Handkerchiefs are doused, stopwatches are produced, and bets are being placed on who can remain standing the longest after a generous sniff. The phrase for medicinal purposes is now covering a multitude of sins. If you happen to pass out, it's not because you're a lightweight, it's because you're a pioneer. Your grandmother claims it soothes her palpitations. Your younger brother claims he saw the future. Your father, who once scoffed at all these modern fads, is now requesting that the butler air out his study after every dinner party. Of course, not everything goes exactly according to plan. There are a few hiccups along the way. It turns out that pouring ether near open flames is a very poor idea, but it takes 3 small kitchen fires and 1 scorched piano to really drive that lesson home. Sometimes guests inhale a little too enthusiastically and spend the entire evening attempting to recite Latin poetry to the wallpaper. Every household starts to develop its own set of emergency protocols, most of which involve just lying on the fainting couch and hopping that nobody tells the vicar. As the sensation spreads, so does the hysteria. Newspapers begin to alternate between breathless praise and dire warnings. Society threatened by new fad. Are our daughters safe? Moralists, clutching at the last threads of decency, warn that ether is going to unravel the very fabric of civilization. This is all before anyone even invents jazz, so the bar for moral collapse is still quite low. Public lectures are held. Physicians argue passionately with ministers. The only people who seem entirely unconcerned are the chemists, who are now able to afford much larger hats. But even in this swirl of anxiety, ether has become the new measure of progress. If you're not at least pretending to understand its scientific properties, you risk being labeled as backward, old-fashioned, or worst of all, dull. Invitations to ether parties become a new kind of currency. Everyone's neighbor is an expert. Everyone's physician is an enthusiast. And even the most somber of uncles now nods knowingly whenever the word sulfuric is mentioned. So here you are, poised between progress and panic, between science and sensation. You're not entirely sure if you're living in an age of enlightenment or just the world's longest group experiment. But you do know one thing for sure. Nobody is bored. The quest for scientific understanding has rarely been this exhilarating, or this likely to end with someone snoring into a potted plant. Welcome to Victorian science, where the only thing greater than discovery is denial, and where, for a brief, intoxicating moment, sensation trumps sense, and everyone is just a little bit hysterical. It's Saturday night, and the most exclusive invitation in town isn't for a ball, it's for an ether frolic. The dress code is formal despair. The main activity is inhaling vapor until you can't feel your own monocle. The food is mostly untouched because everyone is far too busy giggling at the wallpaper. Let's step inside. A long row of carriages is clogging the street outside the most fashionable townhouse in Mayfair. Inside, the air is thick with anticipation and several legally questionable fumes. Gilt mirrors are gleaming in the candlelight, and every available surface is draped in damask. Guests arrive in their finest, swaddled in silks and lace, and each one is secretly hopping that no one notices their hands are already trembling with anticipation. This is not your average soiree. This is a night for letting your starched collar down. You're greeted at the door by a butler who is definitely pretending he's not worried about all the open flames near the entertainment table. In the parlor, decanters of ether are sitting right next to the port, flanked by cut glass bowls of dried rose petals and a few very nervous canapes. The host, who is always someone with more money than sense, raises a glass and announces, "Let us indulge in the wonders of chemistry." The crowd cheers, although it's unclear if anyone actually heard the speech or if they just got a whiff a little early. The evening begins with a certain decorum, as every Victorian gathering must. Gentlemen are debating parliamentary procedure while eyeing the ether bottle. Ladies are discussing embroidery with the wide-eyed intensity of people who are plotting an escape. Soon, though, someone cracks. Usually, it's a minor baroness who's had a rough week. She reaches for a handkerchief, soaks it generously, and in less than a minute, she's giggling into her shawl and declaring her undying love for the ceiling rose. And that's all it takes. Suddenly, the dam bursts. Ether-soaked cloths are being passed from hand to hand, and respectable matrons are soon found sprawled on fainting couches, recounting childhood memories they may or may not have actually invented. Sir Percival, who hasn't laughed since the Corn Laws were repealed, is now snorting with glee as he tries to teach a spaniel how to play poker. Meanwhile, the ether is doing what it does best. It lowers inhibitions, dissolves dignity, and inspires some bizarre party games. Someone suggests charades. 5 minutes later, 3 viscounts are reenacting the Battle of Trafalgar using only a soup ladle and an ornamental vase. Someone else proposes a game of Guess the Smell, which ends poorly after Lady Foxton confuses the ether for her lemon hand lotion and spends the rest of the night trying to speak French. The host staff, who are veterans of 1,000 awkward dinner parties, move quietly among the revelers, righting toppled side tables and gently removing the occasional unconscious Earl from the center of the rug. The footman who is tasked with refilling the decanters is now a local legend. Rumor has it he once revived the entire ladies' auxiliary with a single whiff. Meanwhile, the cook is waiting anxiously down in the kitchen, listening to the distant sounds of spontaneous laughter and hoping the veal will survive until someone remembers to eat. In one corner, the family doctor stands by with an air of resigned professionalism. He dispenses just a dash more, for science, to anyone who asks, all the while calculating how long he can stay before he's called away to tend to another fainting spell. When he's pressed for his professional opinion, he just shrugs and mutters something about the future of medicine before wandering off to check on a group of young men who are reciting poetry to the grandfather clock. The ether party, above all, is an equalizer. Titles and fortunes don't matter much when everyone is horizontal and half the crowd thinks the wallpaper is whispering secrets to them. By midnight, the parlor has become a nest of softly snoring aristocrats. Their dreams are full of swirling colors, improbable adventures, and absolutely no memory of what happened to the soup. And in the stillness, as the candles gutter and the ether finally dissipates, you can't help but think that this is history in the making. It's a brief, extravagant rebellion against boredom, an absurd chapter written in perfume and vapor. Victorian society will have itself all tidied up by sunrise. But for a few wild hours, you got to see what happens when all the rules just evaporate. For Victorian women, ether is freedom in a bottle. Finally, there's something more exciting to do than embroidery. You take one inhale, and suddenly your corset feels optional. Your suitor actually looks interesting, and you could not care less what Lady Wrigglesworth thinks about it. For a brief, dizzy moment, being delicate is actually fun. Let's set the stage for this. You are a lady of good breeding, which mostly just means you are tired, over-supervised, and on a steady diet of boiled turnips and social anxiety. Every morning, you're laced into a garment that was clearly engineered by sadists, and then you're told to keep your opinions soft and your wrists even softer. Your life is a daily schedule of sitting rooms, chaperoned walks, and learning how to faint convincingly enough to escape Aunt Prudence's lectures on moral fiber. There's needlepoint, there's piano practice, and if you're very, very lucky, there's gossip about someone else's failed courtship. And then enter ether, a tiny bottle of scandal all wrapped up in the veneer of modern medicine. At first, it arrives as just a whisper, a remedy for nerves and female hysteria. Those mysterious afflictions that seem to be caused by having too many thoughts or not nearly enough cake. The family doctor who, let's be honest, prescribes laudanum for everything from a broken heart to a stubbed toe, starts recommending ether for your delicate constitution. Your mother feigns concern, but she's secretly curious. Your cousin has already tried it twice and claims it's the only way she managed to survive last season's poetry readings. The first time you try it is at a tea party. It's all just giggles and the clatter of porcelain. But underneath all the lace, everyone is tense, in an unspoken contest of whose gloves are the whitest and whose sighs are the most dramatic. Someone produces a bottle of ether for a touch of melancholy. And suddenly, the real party begins. A discreet dab on a handkerchief, a quick sniff, and the room just dissolves into laughter and secret confessions. The world softens around the edges. Even the vicar's jokes start to seem funny. Ether for women is a quiet revolution. It blurs the boundaries of decorum. You're no longer just performing frailty, you're floating in it. The rules loosen for a moment. You're allowed to speak your mind, to laugh a little too loudly, to ignore the constant monitoring of your posture and your thoughts. You swap stories with your friends, you confess minor scandals, and you even admit that sometimes you wish you could run away and become a governess in Vienna. Or even better, a stage actress. Scandalous, yes, but who's going to judge you? Lady Wrigglesworth is halfway through an ether-induced story about the time she once ran barefoot through the rain. The men, of course, are completely baffled. They just stand on the periphery of these gatherings, nervously clearing their throats and pretending to read the newspaper. Occasionally, one of them is invited to join the ladies, and he spends the entire afternoon in awe as the women, who are usually so reserved, devolve into a group of giggling philosophers. The more conservative matrons disapprove, but even they have to admit that family dinners are much more interesting now that someone has confessed to stealing the cook's brandy. There's a practical side to it too. Ether is convenient, easy to hide in a reticule, impossible for a chaperone to monitor, and it's fast-acting enough to bring genuine relief from the relentless weight of expectations. Some women use it just to get through interminable evenings of dull suitors and sermons about duty. Others treat it as a social ritual, a little secret shared between sisters, cousins, and friends. One drop for courage, one drop for camaraderie. Of course, the whispers eventually reach the men in charge. Concerned husbands and fathers commission articles in the newspapers that warn of the dangers of female overexcitement. They consult doctors who, depending on the size of their consulting fee, either denounce ether as the end of civilization or quietly pocket a bottle for their own wives. But it's too late. The ether genie is out of the bottle, and no amount of moralizing is going to put it back. For Victorian women, ether is more than just a fad. It's a breath of rebellion, a chance to be bold, to be silly, and to be, for a moment, completely unbothered by the endless tangle of rules. For once, being delicate is powerful, and languishing on a couch is the best fun you've ever had. You're a man of property. You own several hats. But tonight, you're faced with a brand new social question. Do you take the ether, or do you remain a paragon of restraint? Half the room is already giggling uncontrollably. The other half is trying to light their cigars and failing miserably. This, apparently, is what progress looks like. Let's set the scene. The gentlemen have all retreated to the library, that wood-paneled temple to good taste and even better brandy. The air is thick with cigar smoke and a quiet sort of bravado. On the mahogany table, nestled among the crystal decanters and scandalous French novels, sits an unassuming bottle of ether. For a moment, everyone pretends not to notice it. They debate parliamentary reform. They discuss cricket scores that no one really remembers, and they recount the one time they almost met Charles Dickens. But eventually, the topic shifts, as it always does, to the latest sensation that's sweeping through the salon's ether. For the Victorian gentleman, the dilemma is a real one. Do you partake in this fashionable scientific miracle and risk your dignity? Or do you scoff at the trend and risk looking hopelessly old-fashioned? Lord Bletchley, who is always the first to try anything imported or explosive, claims it's the best thing since starched collars. He waves his handkerchief and offers a demonstration, inhaling deeply, and within seconds, attempting to quote Shakespeare while simultaneously unbuttoning his waistcoat and complimenting the rug. The room splits. Half the men, inspired by Bletchley's courage, or perhaps just by the possibility of escaping the evening's third discussion of corn tariffs, follow suit. They dab their handkerchiefs, they take a tentative sniff, and soon the library is alive with undignified laughter. Sir Gerald, who last smiled in 1839, is hiccuping in a wingback chair, insisting that he's just discovered a new color. Someone else tries to recount his years at Oxford, but gets stuck on the word quadrangle and never escapes. It's as if every repressed chuckle, every politely swallowed complaint, just comes bubbling out in one grand, ether-fueled release. But not everyone is convinced. The traditionalists are clinging to their pipes and their skepticism. A real man doesn't need artificial stimulants, declares Colonel Fitzwilliam, whose definition of a good time hasn't evolved since the Crimean War. He glares at the ether bottle as if it personally owes him money. There's talk of moral decay, of the importance of self-control, and the decline of British grit. Someone mutters something about the French, and for a brief moment, everyone agrees that the French are probably to blame for all of this. The pressure is palpable. Refusing the ether can feel like you're admitting you have something to hide, or worse, that you're afraid of having fun. But partaking means you're risking your carefully cultivated reputation as a man of discipline. It's a high-wire act, balanced between stoic composure and the tantalizing promise of a few minutes of escape from the crushing weight of gentlemanly expectations. Of course, there's also an element of competition to it. Who can take the biggest whiff without toppling over? Who can recite Latin backwards or keep a straight face while everyone else is howling at nothing? Wagers are placed, rules are invented, and the normally somber library becomes a scene of mild chaos. For once, being a man of the world means surrendering to complete nonsense, if only for a night. Meanwhile, the butler is standing by, resigned, polishing glasses with the same cloth he uses to mop up the occasional spill. He's seen worse, much worse, if you count the incident with the absinthe and the parrot. But he's quietly rooting for the men to come to their senses, before someone tries to ride the billiards table to freedom. As the ether fades and the room quiets down, the men slowly recover their composure. There are embarrassed coughs, sheepish grins, and a hurried return to the comfort of port and self-deprecating jokes. But something has changed. For a brief, vaporous hour, the gentlemen have experienced true freedom, the right to be absolutely ridiculous. And maybe, just maybe, progress isn't such a bad thing after all, especially if it comes with a little laughter, a little humility, and the sudden realization that even the stiffest upper lip needs to wobble sometimes. It's 8 in the morning. The birds are singing, and your head feels like a misplaced science experiment. You vaguely remember dancing on a piano and debating the finer points of taxidermy with someone. The only thing left is the lingering scent of ether and a deep, unshakable sense of existential dread. The morning after an ether party is nothing like the genteel Victorian breakfasts you see in paintings. Instead of sunlight streaming through spotless windows onto crisp linen, you wake up to a room that smells faintly of burning wool and misplaced ambition. There's an overturned chair by the fireplace. A half-eaten custard tart is clinging to the curtains. Someone has left a glove in the teapot. It's all perfectly normal if you happen to live in a state of mild chemical confusion. You sit up and immediately regret it. Your head feels simultaneously too heavy and too light, like it's full of wet cotton and misplaced regrets. The mirror across the room reflects a pale figure with wild hair and the haunted eyes of someone who just remembered they recited love poetry to a houseplant. Your mouth tastes like a blend of rose water, brandy, and all of last night's poor decisions. As you grope around for a sense of dignity, or at least your left shoe, the household slowly begins to stir. Downstairs, the cook is threatening to quit again after finding a trail of cheese leading all the way to the library. The butler is carefully picking playing cards out of the soup tureen. In the hallway, a distant relative is still fast asleep on a pile of antimacassars, snoring the smug, contented snore of someone who hasn't yet remembered that they spent a good part of last night trying to teach the spaniel to play poker. Breakfast is served. Normally, this would be a social occasion, a parade of toast, soft-boiled eggs, polite conversation, and at least one person pretending not to be hung over. But today, the atmosphere is different. The guests shuffle to the table in slow motion, clutching their cups of coffee like survivors of a shipwreck. Eye contact is avoided at all costs. Nobody mentions the previous night. Not the dancing, not the impromptu monologue about Napoleon's favorite biscuits, and certainly not the ether. Still, there's an odd sort of camaraderie in the air. A sense that, for better or worse, everyone has been through something together. Lady Featherstone, usually the very embodiment of reserve, lets out a snort of laughter at the sight of Sir Lionel's new haircut, which may or may not have happened after midnight. Even the strictest aunt in the house seems a little softer this morning, sipping her tea with the quiet resignation of a woman who has decided to forgive herself, if only for today. Of course, the physical side effects are a bit less forgiving. Ether, it turns out, is not known for its gentle wake-up call. There's a dull ache behind your eyes, a tingling in your fingers, and the unsettling sensation that your internal organs are conducting a quiet protest. The family doctor is summoned, and he looks a bit worse for wear himself. He prescribes rest, a brisk walk, and absolutely no more vapor for at least a fortnight. No one listens, obviously. The only ones who seem unaffected are the children and the pets, who seem energized by all the chaos. The youngest cousin is still wearing 3 cravats and a lampshade, announcing his candidacy for Parliament. The cat, as always, just looks judgmental. By mid-morning, the memory of the party begins to fade. Guests disperse, some to nap, some to nurse their regrets, and a few brave souls to actually read the newspaper and see if any new etiquette rules have been invented overnight. The staff quietly restores order, erasing all the evidence of debauchery with the efficient resignation of people who have seen it all before. And you resolve to avoid ether forever, or at least until the next invitation arrives, promising good company and just a harmless little sniff. After all, it's only polite. Welcome to the Victorian morning after. You're a little older, a little wiser, and just sober enough to remember why you only do this once a week. Ether started out as a wonder drug. It was an anesthetic, a tonic, a miracle. Soon, it was being handed out like party favors for every ailment you could think of, real or imagined. Sprained your ankle? Have some ether. A broken heart? Ether. Bad poetry? You should probably try a double dose. Let's rewind to the very beginning, when the ether craze was born, not in the back rooms of shady apothecaries, but in the well-lit, deeply self-assured offices of Victorian medicine. In a world where the best a doctor could offer you were leeches, vinegar baths, or maybe a slap on the back, ether arrived like a gift from the heavens. Here at last was a substance that seemed to work instantly. The very first time a London surgeon waved a dripping rag over a nervous patient and watched him drift off to dreamland, the city lost its collective mind. Medical progress, it seemed, could be bottled. Word spread fast. Within a year, every doctor worth his salt, and several who weren't, was prescribing ether. And not just for operations, but for everything. It was recommended for coughs, for melancholy, for female troubles, and for that ever-mysterious diagnosis of nerves. Victorian Britain pretty much ran on nerves, a condition brought on by tight waistbands, aggressive wallpaper, and the stress of pretending to enjoy boiled mutton. Ether, the medical journals all insisted, was a safe, scientific solution to the constant hum of anxiety. At first, ether was the exclusive domain of the upper classes, administered in their drawing rooms by physicians who looked suspiciously cheerful for men surrounded by so many sick people. A good doctor always traveled with an ether bottle in his bag, nestled right between the smelling salts and a copy of Galen for gentlemen. Some even advertised their skills in the newspaper. Headaches banished, hysteria cured, discreet visits arranged, ether provided. The lines between treatment and recreation blurred very quickly. Society ladies claimed they needed ether for their fainting spells and other minor complaints. But it was hard not to notice that these spells always seemed to coincide with garden parties or particularly dull musical recitals. Gentlemen sought relief from the pressures of empire and managing their estates, or failing that, from a long evening stuck next to Lord Roxbury at dinner. It didn't take long for the side effects to start appearing. The first signs were small. Someone forgetting their own name at a family supper, or a duchess suddenly becoming convinced her lap dog was reciting Shakespeare. But soon, the problems became much harder to ignore. Dinner parties started ending with guests sprawled all across the furniture. Not from boredom, but from a potent combination of too much ether and not nearly enough common sense. Rumors began to spread of entire households being knocked out before dessert was even served. Doctors tried to reassure the public. It's completely safe in moderation, they intoned, while discreetly pocketing a few bottles for their own personal research. Behind the scenes, however, a panic was starting to stir. Letters were pouring in from worried patients. My husband believes he is a cloud. Mother has not stopped singing since Whitsuntide. Is it normal for my uncle to sleep in the coal scuttle? Even the most enthusiastic practitioners had to admit that things were getting a little out of hand. But the demand didn't drop. Instead, it grew. Soon, ether was being sold in every chemist shop in the city. Housewives kept it on the mantelpiece. Poets swore by its powers of inspiration. Politicians would discreetly take a whiff before parliamentary debates, hoping it might make the Chancellor of the Exchequer sound interesting for once. That's when the regrets truly began to set in. The Royal College of Physicians released a statement warning of deplorable consequences. Cartoonists had a field day, drawing doctors fleeing from clouds of ether like startled pheasants. At parties, the phrase doctor's orders became a running joke, usually muttered just before someone fell face first into the punch bowl. The great medical hope had become a complete punchline. Ether, once hailed as the miracle of the age, now came with a side order of chaos and regret. And somewhere, in 1,000 tidy homes, doctors were nursing their own headaches and quietly switching to gin, because nothing in history spreads faster than a bad idea that's been wrapped in a doctor's handwriting. Nothing says romance like a little shared intoxication. Victorian courtship was already incredibly awkward. But now, everyone's fainting for real. Marriage proposals are getting weird. Love letters are becoming completely illegible. And the most popular wedding gift is a monogrammed ether bottle. To set the scene, it's a damp London evening, and you, a hopeful suitor, have just been invited to an exclusive salon. You've polished your boots. You've memorized 3 acceptable compliments for a lady's hair, and you've practiced the art of brooding near the pianoforte. You arrive only to find that the usual tedium of parlor games and forced small talk has been replaced by a new social ritual, passing around the ether. The room is humming with nervous laughter as the first handkerchief is soaked and offered to the bravest heart in the room. Victorian romance, in theory, is a carefully choreographed dance, full of coded glances, chaperoned walks, and endless talk about the weather. In practice, it's a complete mess of nerves and unspoken hopes, all made worse by social rules so complex they basically require a flowchart. Now add ether to the equation, and the results are nothing short of spectacular. The shyest debutante in the room is suddenly the loudest, declaring her love for Lord Byron and challenging anyone who doubts her to a duel in French. Suitors who had spent weeks rehearsing clever witticisms end up just reciting nursery rhymes and giggling, so hard they nearly swallow their cufflinks. A whole new etiquette starts to emerge. The question is no longer, may I offer you some punch, but rather, would you care for a whiff? Accepting a handkerchief becomes a secret signal, a Victorian version of swiping right. If your intended laughs instead of swooning, you know you've found a kindred spirit. If she faints, well, at least it's not from boredom this time. Even the seasoned matchmakers are completely baffled. The old strategies just don't apply anymore. Carefully planned moonlit walks are replaced by spontaneous poetry readings, sometimes addressed to the family dog. Engagement rings are occasionally lost somewhere in the upholstery. The phrase "swept off her feet" starts to take on a much more literal meaning. The poetry of ether romance is questionable, to say the least. Love letters, usually so flowery and overwrought, become masterpieces of incoherence. Dearest Penelope, your eyes remind me of mist, and possibly soup, writes one hopeful beau before spilling ink all over his lapel and falling asleep halfway through his sonnet. Lady Evelina receives 7 proposals in one night, none of which she can remember, and she wakes up to find a bouquet of slightly chewed parsley on her pillow. Parents and chaperones, always the last to catch on, attempt to restore some sense of order. Mothers warn their daughters of the dangers of vaporous attachments. Fathers start to patrol the hallways, looking for young men who are carrying suspicious-looking bottles. The family physician is called in to supervise, but he's soon found enthusiastically debating Aristotle with the coat rack. Even the vicar is compromised, having accidentally inhaled while delivering a sermon on the dangers of modernity. But there's a gentle irony at play here. For all the chaos, ether romance is the most honest courtship society has seen in years. The masks begin to slip. The practiced lines and icy manners just dissolve into laughter, candor, and the occasional duet sung off-key in the conservatory. Real feelings, which are usually crushed beneath 3 layers of etiquette, begin to emerge. Lady Georgina confesses that she's always hated embroidery. Sir Charles admits that he writes poetry about potatoes. 2 young lovers, previously paralyzed by their own shyness, find themselves holding hands and making plans to run away and open a bakery in Bath. Of course, not all of these matches survive the morning after. Some promises that were made in a haze of euphoria are quietly renegotiated over weak tea and a lot of apologies. But for those brief, glittering nights, romance is alive in the ether, chaotic, unpredictable, and real in a way that Victorian society rarely allows. In the end, ether becomes the patron saint of ill-advised proposals and grand declarations. If love is a kind of madness, then surely the Victorians have finally discovered the cure for it, and it's waiting in a cut glass bottle right on the mantelpiece. Downstairs, the staff has seen it all before. As the gentry swoon and hallucinate, the butlers develop a sixth sense for catching falling viscounts, and the maids invent new methods for discreetly airing out the drawing room. Behind every single ether disaster is a servant, quietly judging their employer. It starts as a whisper among the housemaids. There's a new craze going on upstairs, all about bottles and handkerchiefs changing hands like secret messages. For a household servant in Victorian England, nothing is ever really a secret for long. Ether, they note, smells much sharper than any cologne, and it lingers in the curtains for days. The scullery maid is the first to comment, scrunching up her nose and muttering, "The master's friends have brought another one of their modern airs, and now the cat won't even come inside." The staff is used to cleaning up after fads. They've survived the era of Turkish cigarettes, laudanum cough syrup, and whatever that health broth phase was that turned all the drawing room rugs green. But ether presents a whole new kind of challenge. After the first ether party, the butler finds Lord Wyndham snoring in the billiards room, draped over the table like a beached walrus. The parlor maid, trying to dust around an unconscious debutante, wonders out loud if this is what progress smells like. The servants quickly develop their own coping strategies. The butler keeps a discreet stash of strong coffee ready for any post-party emergencies and quietly signals to the kitchen to keep a pot of restorative broth simmering through the night. The head housemaid opens every single window at dawn, braving the wrath of any guest who wakes up shivering and confused, convinced they've fallen asleep in a barn. Maids become experts at removing ether stains from lace and scrubbing mysterious footprints off the mahogany, all without ever asking who or what left them there. They hear things too. Bits of ether-induced poetry come drifting down the stairwell. There are heated debates about the best way to seduce a rhododendron. And then there's the unmistakable thump of someone attempting to waltz solo in the upstairs corridor. The staff is sworn to discretion, but there's always a risk. An overheard scandal, a misplaced letter, a secret romance revealed in a fit of giggles. And yet they keep the secrets. After all, a well-timed silence is the currency of the servant class. Occasionally, the boundaries blur. A footman might be persuaded to sample a harmless whiff when he's invited by a flirtatious guest. The cook, who is usually immune to fashion, takes a sniff and spends half the evening serenading a soup tin. For the most part, though, the staff keeps their distance, observing everything with the weary wisdom of those who know that every fashion has its price, and that someone else will always be left to sweep up the aftermath. As ether becomes a fixture of the household, the servants adapt. The housekeeper just updates her list of extra cleaning duties. Air the parlors. Check for unconscious guests before locking up. And never, ever let the dog into the library after midnight. There are new codes, new signals, and a thriving underground network for swapping tips on how to revive a countess or how to remove the scent of ether from velvet curtains. But with this adaptation comes power. The servants, who are always underestimated, know more about the household than anyone upstairs ever realizes. They know which guests are likely to faint, who always sneaks an extra handkerchief, and which heirloom vase was really broken by the cat. Spoiler alert, it wasn't the cat. The butler becomes a master of timing, ushering guests out at just the right moment to preserve their dignity and avoid any awkward questions. At the end of the night, as the gentry drift off to sleep or into uneasy dreams, the servants remain awake a little longer, restoring order and rewriting the record of what actually happened. Tomorrow, the household will wake up to neat rooms, fresh linens, and no trace of chaos, except perhaps for the knowing glance shared over the breakfast service. For in every Victorian house that's been touched by ether, it's the servants who are truly running the show, keeping the secrets, cleaning up the mess, and holding the very fabric of society together, one bewildered baronet at a time. Have you ever tried mixing flammable vapor with candles and a series of bad decisions? Victorian homes did it every single night. The only thing more surprising than the sound of a chandelier falling was realizing that nobody had invented a fire extinguisher yet. Let's be honest, for all their talk about progress, Victorians had a bad habit of introducing new technology without considering minor details, like safety. And nothing captured this spirit better than the Great Ether Experiment, which was conducted nightly in salons, libraries, and on at least one occasion, the conservatory, where the ferns are still traumatized to this day. It turns out that when you add a highly flammable anesthetic to a house that's full of open flames, silk curtains, and distracted aristocrats, you don't get scientific advancement so much as a recipe for chaos. It always starts with good intentions. The host, eager to impress, wants to demonstrate the latest marvels of modern chemistry. Observe, dear friends, the wonders of ether, he announces, while an unfortunate footman stands by with a tray of handkerchiefs. Everyone gathers around, squabbling politely over who gets to inhale first. Candles are flickering in the draft from an open window, and the gas lamps are humming ominously in the background. The butler's eye begins to twitch. The first mishaps are always small. A dropped handkerchief here, a glass of claret spilled there. Lady Agnes leans a little too close to the fire and singes her fringe, which, according to the local hairdresser, is the most exciting thing to happen to her all year. A young gentleman, attempting to impress his peers, decides to see what happens if you pour ether into a glass and light it. The answer, for those of you keeping score at home, is a brief, enthusiastic fireball and the loss of one very good mustache. The chaos ramps up pretty quickly. Someone faints a little too close to the marble bust of Homer, which results in a loud crash and a nose that will never be the same again. The host's prized Persian rug now sports a suspiciously sticky patch where ether, punch, and possibly some kind of dessert have collided in a perfect storm of negligence. The dog, meanwhile, has developed an unwise fondness for ether-soaked handkerchiefs and is discovered later sleeping upside down in the coal scuttle. But the true disasters always involve the combination of ether and the ever-present open flame. Victorian homes are just full of hazards. There are candles on every surface, oil lamps perched on mantelpieces, and fireplaces roaring away even in July. Tradition, after all, is non-negotiable. All it takes is one distracted guest waving an ether-soaked kerchief a little too close to the candelabra, and suddenly, everyone is treated to an impromptu pyrotechnics display. The results range from scorched tablecloths to the rapid unveiling of bald spots as gentlemen frantically pat out their singed hair. And it isn't just fire either. Ether can leave people dizzy, confused, and incredibly clumsy. Hardly ideal in a world full of porcelain figurines and antique glassware. Whole evenings have been lost to the sound of shattering vases, toppled screens, and the faint but unmistakable wail of a maid, discovering that someone has mistaken the umbrella stand for a chamber pot. Medical mishaps are common, too. More than one guest has woken up on the floor, convinced they've been transported to another dimension, only to find themselves tangled in the fringed edge of a Turkish carpet. Of course, the aftermath is a perfect lesson in Victorian discretion. Guests smooth their hair, they dust off the debris, and they assure their host that they quite enjoyed the spectacle. The staff, ever resourceful, rushes in to cover up burn marks with strategically placed potted palms. The doctor, who arrived late and missed all the explosions, prescribes fresh air and a calming sherry. The next day, the host is left to survey the damage. Scorched curtains, broken heirlooms, and the distinct aroma of singed pride. But no matter. The invitations for the next ether frolic are already being written. For in Victorian England, science always moves forward, even if it occasionally sets the parlor on fire along the way. Even the nursery isn't safe. Curious children find the ether stash, and suddenly the governess is reading bedtime stories to a group of toddlers who are convinced they're floating above the Thames. Victorian parenting was still a work in progress. To set the scene, just imagine a grand townhouse at dusk. Upstairs, the grown-ups are all gathered in the drawing room, lost in laughter, vapor, and an increasingly abstract conversation. Down the hall, in a sunlit nursery that's trimmed with lace and stuffed animals that all seem to have slightly judgmental eyes, a new adventure is unfolding. It starts, as these things always do, with curiosity and an unlocked cabinet. Master Archie, who is 7 years old, has already been caught twice this week experimenting with the effects of treacle on clockwork mice. Now, with the mysterious glass bottles left unattended on the hall table, the children are about to expand their scientific inquiries in some bold new directions. Ether to a Victorian child is basically a magic potion. The label says it's for nerves. But what could be more nerve-wracking than a spelling lesson? Or worse, another forced performance on the pianoforte? Miss Jane, who is 9, points out that the adults seem to enjoy ether quite a lot, and that anything hidden from children must be either dangerous or highly desirable. After a quick whispered vote, the decision is made. A little experiment is in order. The application is, predictably, completely haphazard. A doll's bonnet is soaked. A napkin is dabbed. And soon, the nursery smells like a combination of lavender sachets, birthday candles, and poor judgment. Within minutes, the results begin to show. The twins claim that they can see colors that haven't even been invented yet. Archie tries to convince his younger sister that she has turned into a particularly elegant flamingo. The cat bolts under the bed, and the nursery maid, entering with a tray of boiled sweets, is greeted by 3 children attempting to float by holding onto the curtain tassels. The governess, long-suffering and severely underpaid, walks in to find absolute mayhem. It's a scene of cheerful anarchy. One child is trying to recite Latin backwards. Another is gently spinning in circles while singing about steamboats. And a third is gazing out the window and announcing that she can see the entire empire from here. The room is a riot of giggles, scattered toys, and one overturned footstool. The governess, torn between horror and the faint urge to just laugh, immediately sets about restoring order with all the sternness she can possibly muster. She threatens to write to every parent, uncle, and godparent in the address book, though she quietly admits to herself that the sight of Archie attempting to salute the wallpaper is something she'll treasure forever. Once order is finally restored and everyone is corralled back into their beds, the aftermath is surprisingly peaceful. The ether, like so many Victorian fads, is fleeting in its effect, and the children just drift into a deep, dreamless sleep. The governess, grateful for the quiet, wonders whether ether has been secretly used in nurseries for years. It certainly seems more effective than bedtime stories about obedient foxes or the glories of the British Empire. By morning, the incident is already halfway to becoming a legend. The children are whispering conspiratorially at breakfast, inventing ever more elaborate tales about their voyage through the clouds. Master Archie, who is either a future barrister or a train robber depending on who you ask, quietly pockets a handkerchief for some future research. The cat continues to avoid the nursery, just in case. Meanwhile, the adults remain blissfully unaware. As they debate the finer points of poetry and vapor down in the drawing room, their children have become pioneers in the art of questionable decision-making. The staff, of course, are the only ones who are truly in the know. The nursemaid leaves an extra cup of strong tea for the governess, and the housekeeper quietly moves the ether bottles to a much higher shelf. Victorian society prided itself on order, discipline, and propriety. Yet in the heart of every great house, rebellion was already brewing, sometimes wearing pinafores and always keeping an eye out for the next forbidden adventure. Because no matter what the age, when it comes to curiosity and chaos, children are the true inheritors of the Victorian spirit. Ether wasn't just some party trick. The medical establishment got in on the action, prescribing it for everything from nerves to female hysteria. Apothecaries did a brisk business, and nobody asked too many questions about what was actually in the ingredients. It all began with good intentions, as these things usually do. The Victorians, who were desperate for remedies to the countless ailments that plagued their nervous, overworked society, embraced the medical marvel of ether with open arms. Surgeons hailed it as a wonder for pain relief. Family doctors added it to their arsenal of cures, right next to leeches, mustard plasters, and the ever-popular tonic of sherry mixed with hope. What could possibly go wrong? The result was an explosion of new suppliers. The neighborhood apothecary, which was previously best known for dispensing cough drops that tasted like old boots, became the center of high society's newest obsession. Behind the counter, jars of powders and mysterious liquids were jostling for space as ether took pride of place. The process of actually acquiring it was absurdly simple. Step 1. Develop a vague complaint. Doctor, I find myself occasionally melancholy at tea time. Step 2. Wait as the chemist nods wisely and produces a small bottle from under the counter. Step 3. Accept your medicine with a wink and the unspoken agreement that nobody needs to mention any of this to your father. The doctors themselves were an odd bunch. There were the earnest men in spectacles who were genuinely hopping to help their patients. And then there were the fashionable physicians who made house calls with silk-lined bags and egos to match. Some of them developed a reputation for being a bit too enthusiastic in their demonstrations, leaving society women faint and society men unusually philosophical about the nature of chairs. It's rumored that one particularly flamboyant physician, Dr. Peregrine St. John, held private therapeutic salons in which the main therapy involved just passing the bottle and discussing the finer points of romantic poetry. Then there were the dandies, the young, fashion-obsessed men who seized upon ether as the latest way to distinguish themselves from the ordinary crowd. Their goal was to be seen snubbing sherry in favor of vapor, and to perfect the art of fainting gracefully on demand. A dandy's evening kit included not just a perfectly tied cravat, but also a monogrammed ether flask and a repertoire of stories about how continental society was doing it much more stylishly over in Paris. If you could deliver a clever bon mot right before swooning, so much the better. But not all of the ether flowed through reputable hands. Where there's demand, there's always a supply. And where there's a supply, there are dubious characters lurking in alleyways, ready to sell whatever passes for the real thing. Fake apothecaries popped up overnight, their shops filled with watered-down bottles and mixtures that smelled suspiciously like turpentine. Newspapers began to report incidents of accidental poisoning. The criminal underworld quickly realized that there was good money in supplying the desperate, the curious, and the perpetually bored. If you weren't careful, the soothing vapor you purchased might leave you not so soothed, but violently ill or simply missing your pocket watch. Still, for many, the risk was part of the thrill. Ether parties began to include a competitive element, whose bottle came from the most exclusive supplier, who had the purest vapor, the most daring story of acquisition. The line between a medical marvel and a social status symbol blurred, until it all just became a single, heady swirl of fashion, chemistry, and poor decision-making. By the end of the ether craze, doctors were issuing stern warnings. Apothecaries were nervously double-checking their labels, and the dandies were already sniffing around for the next big thing. But for a brief, extraordinary moment, everyone in Victorian high society, from the most respected surgeon to the shadiest street vendor, had their hands in the ether jar. And as always, no one quite knew whether they were curing society or simply making it much, much stranger. Rumor has it that even the royal family dabbled in the new fad. If it's true, it would be the only time a British monarch was both the ruler of an empire and the life of the party. At the palace, etiquette is strictly enforced, unless someone happens to drop the ether bottle, in which case all bets are off. To set the scene, it's a chilly evening at Buckingham Palace, and the halls are bustling with liveried footmen, anxious equerries, and a menagerie of courtiers who are attempting to look both fashionable and faintly terrified. Queen Victoria herself sits at the head of a table that's so long it requires its own postal system. On the surface, everything is exactly as it should be. Rigid formality, measured conversation, and the slow, steady passing of soup. But beneath the surface, there's a buzz. Something new is circulating among the royal set. It begins innocently, as these things always do. Prince Albert, ever the modernizer, has heard about the latest medical marvel from the continent, and he's keen to impress his wife and her retinue. Ether, he declares, is the future of both science and personal tranquility. He's even had it delivered by a royal courier, ensuring that it arrives with more fanfare than most minor dukes. The court physician, who is eager to please and not entirely immune to peer pressure, demonstrates its therapeutic value by offering a discreet sniff to the Duchess of Kent, who promptly declares herself vastly improved. Soon, ether is being offered with the same solemnity as the best sherry. A line of glass bottles, monogrammed with the royal crest, appears right beside the silver teapots. The ladies in waiting all exchange glances, half scandalized and half intrigued. Some whisper that Her Majesty herself has given permission for a little experimentation, as long as it's conducted behind closed doors and not in view of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Inevitably, someone takes things a step too far. Lord Elgin, never one to miss out on a trend, sniffs a bit too deeply and has to be helped to the chaise longue by 3 footmen and a highly amused Princess Alice. Across the table, the Countess of Fife dissolves into giggles, accidentally spilling syllabub into a priceless inkwell. In the next room, a junior equerry is discovered composing poetry to the royal corgis, who, if we're being honest, have heard far worse. Protocol quickly crumbles. The master of ceremonies, whose entire job it is to keep the monarchy running on schedule, finds himself chasing after a group of lords who are determined to measure the acoustics of the grand staircase by how loudly they can sing God Save the Queen in falsetto. Etiquette books are hastily consulted, but they offer very little advice on how to handle a peer of the realm who insists he's invented a new dance that involves only his knees. Through it all, Queen Victoria maintains an air of dignified bemusement. She's no stranger to medical innovation. After all, she famously endorsed chloroform for childbirth, to the horror of half the bishops in England. Perhaps she sees in ether a harmless little escape for her court, a way for her tightly wound aristocrats to loosen their collars and for a few moments forget about the demands of empire. Or perhaps she simply enjoys the spectacle of a visiting ambassador attempting to curtsy to a palm tree. Of course, discretion is key. Officially, no one at court partakes in anything more scandalous than a vigorous constitutional walk. Unofficially, rumors are swirling. Did Prince Leopold really organize a midnight ether party? Was the Archbishop caught napping in the library with a suspiciously sweet-smelling kerchief? Did Queen Victoria herself ever take a whiff? The palace refuses to comment, but the effect is clear. For a brief, vaporous season, the monarchy isn't just the head of state. It's the epicenter of mayhem. The grandest rules are bent. Laughter echoes through the marble corridors. And even the stoniest dowager finds herself grinning at the memory of a night when Buckingham Palace belonged to progress, curiosity, and a tiny bottle of mischief. In the end, the courtiers all compose themselves. The servants restore order, and the official record remains spotless. But behind the palace doors, a little cloud of rebellion still lingers. It's a gentle reminder that even queens and kings sometimes need to let their hair down, and occasionally their guards too. No trend can escape the Victorian press. Once the reporters catch on, ether becomes the latest headline scandal, usually wedged right between a story about railway delays and an editorial about the dangers of jazz hands. At first, the newspapers are merely curious. Editors send out their most junior reporters to cover this strange new medical vapor being whispered about in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. A small blurb appears in the society column, neatly tucked beside the news of Lady Havisham's poodle's birthday. The language is cautious. Certain advanced social circles have been observed to indulge in continental chemical amusements. The medical community is divided. Translation: no one has any idea what's happening, but someone's aunt fainted into the trifle. But things escalate quickly. A rival paper gets hold of a particularly juicy tidbit. A viscount, normally famous for his sobriety, was spotted attempting to conduct the orchestra at Covent Garden with a dessert spoon. Suddenly, ether is everywhere. Headlines are screaming gaslight and gasps. The peril in our parlors and society swoons. New fad sweeps London's elite. Cartoonists have a field day, filling their pages with sketches of monocled baronets collapsing into bouquets and society dames declaring their undying love for umbrella stands. Penny dreadfuls, always happy to sensationalize things, seize on the trend, warning of ghostly apparitions and secret societies, all fueled by a whiff of ether. One particularly dramatic serial describes a masked ball that devolves into chaos after the host's soothing vapor turns the guests into a frenzied mob, dancing widdershins to the sound of invisible bagpipes. Middle-class parents are suddenly on high alert. Letters pour into the editor's offices. Is our youth at risk? Will my daughter abandon her embroidery for ether? Asks one anxious mother, whose daughter, it must be said, was never much interested in embroidery to begin with. Public outrage follows right on the heels of curiosity. Moral reformers, never ones to miss out on a good crisis, take to the letters page. Is this the end of civilization? Asks Reverend Josiah Grumble, warning that ether may lead not only to idleness but, even worse, to the French. The Times prints a sober editorial. We, as a nation, must ask ourselves whether progress is best measured by scientific discovery or by the ability to remain upright through supper. Satirical weeklies suggest a new parliamentary bill, the Proper Use of Handkerchiefs Act, 1848. Doctors are summoned to defend their profession. Some respond with robust letters of their own, decrying the ignorant panic-mongering of the yellow press. Others, more entrepreneurial, run discreet advertisements for genuine medical ether, as recommended by leading society physicians. Apothecaries see a spike in business, while simultaneously having to answer to nervous clients. No, madam, it will not cause your husband to develop delusions about the neighbor's goose. Meanwhile, society figures are attempting to weather the storm with varying degrees of success. Some, ever practical, simply hire publicists. Others try to claim they never really liked ether anyway, having always preferred a brisk walk and a glass of sherry. The most daring just double down, hosting educational evenings on the wonders of chemistry, strictly for scientific purposes, of course. A rumor surfaces that the Duchess of Pembridge has agreed to demonstrate the responsible use of ether, only to be found napping mid-lecture with her spectacles askew. But scandal, as ever, is a double-edged sword. For every stern rebuke, there's a curious new guest at the next ether gathering. Young men try to outdo each other in procuring the most exclusive vapors. Young women start adding experimental chemistry to their list of personal accomplishments. The press, despite all its warnings, can't resist covering each new escapade in lavish and occasionally hysterical detail. Circulation soars, and so the ether craze burns ever brighter, fanned by the breathless attention of London's reporters. The public shakes its collective head while secretly checking the society pages for the next outrageous tale. In Victorian England, scandal is never the end of the story. It's only the beginning of the next sensation. So, if you ever wondered why every new trend seems to last just a bit longer than common sense, you can thank the press. After all, no one writes a better love letter to disaster than a bored Victorian journalist. The church is not amused. Sermons are warning of moral decay, and pamphlets are circulating that claim ether will dissolve your sense of duty and possibly your eyebrows. For some, this is just more motivation to double up. Victorian England, for all its scientific pretensions, still knelt every Sunday in fear of hellfire. And the ether craze, with all its vapors and visions, is raising more than a few ecclesiastical eyebrows. The first complaints come quietly. A bishop's secretary finds a perfumed handkerchief in the cathedral, and a rural vicar notices that his congregation is dozing through the homily, their faces looking dreamy and suspiciously content. It isn't long before the pulpits begin to thunder with concern. On a Sunday morning in 1848, the bells toll, the pews are full, and the reverend is in fine form. But there's something new in his sermon today, a warning that's couched in the language of righteous outrage. Beware the seductive vapor, for it is written, "Let not man seek a false paradise in a chemical fog." Congregants shift guiltily in their seats, unsure whether to confess, giggle, or just reach for their smelling salts. The church organist, who attended an ether party the night before, is trying very hard not to fall asleep during the offertory. Pamphlets begin to appear in the vestry. Ether, the devil's own perfume. They claim that ether clouds the soul, weakens the will, and invites all manner of foreign wickedness, by which they mostly mean French philosophy and unchaperoned laughter. The illustrations are lurid, showing skeletal hands passing bottles in the moonlight, and society dames swooning directly into the clutches of cartoonish demons. The message is clear: sniff at your own peril. As with all good moral panics, the warnings are delightfully vague. Some preachers insist that ether is a gateway to ruin, leading inevitably to absinthe, gambling, and the purchase of unflattering hats. Others claim it's an invitation for the supernatural, a sure way to open one's spirit to poltergeists and improper dancing. One enthusiastic curate even declares that no soul can be saved, while its owner is giggling at the wallpaper. The response from the public is mixed. Some take the warnings to heart, swearing off ether in favor of more traditional pastimes like complaining about the weather or attending extremely long prayer meetings. Others view the sermons as a challenge. After all, nothing makes a forbidden fruit more delicious than a vicar's disapproval. If God didn't want us to have ether, quips one dowager, he would have made the parlor less boring. Meanwhile, the clergy find themselves caught in a losing battle with curiosity and human nature. Confessionals are filling up with anxious whisperings of, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sniffed." The church's stance becomes an accidental advertising campaign, and clever hosts begin holding spiritual improvement evenings that feature, between the psalms, just a hint of experimental vapor. Yet beneath all the moralizing, there is genuine fear. A fear that society is changing too quickly for comfort. Ether represents more than just a passing fad. It's the whiff of a new world where pleasure and novelty are competing with tradition and restraint. The old certainties are evaporating, much like the vapor itself. Still, the church soldiers on. The Sunday sermons grow longer. The pamphlets multiply. But by the time the final hymn rings out, half the congregation is already dreaming of a lighter, brighter world, one where even the bishop might take a little whiff, just to see what all the fuss is about. In the end, ether doesn't destroy the soul. It just gives it something new to worry about. And in Victorian England, that's nearly a sacrament in itself. What goes up must inevitably come down. With rising addiction, ruined fortunes, and more than one embarrassing incident involving a bishop and a chaise lounge, the party is almost over. Almost. Morning is breaking over Mayfair, and the sunlight is pitiless. The grand houses are quieter now. Inside, the aftermath of last night's frolic is painfully clear. Wilted bouquets, toppled chairs, and a collection of aristocrats are scattered like exhausted moths across the velvet sofas. The air is heavy, with the scent of overripe lilies and deep regret. No one is laughing now, not even the spaniel, who's hiding beneath the harpsichord with a look on his face that says, "Never again." For those who indulged a little too often, the consequences are not just physical. The telltale signs of ether excess are impossible to ignore. There are headaches of a truly architectural variety, a nausea that not even the strongest tea can cure, and a pervasive brain fog that makes remembering your own name feel like a parlor game. The footman brings in breakfast, dry toast and oranges for delicate stomachs, and is greeted by groans, requests for silence, and the occasional desperate plea for a doctor who won't judge. Fortunes, too, are suffering. That once impressive collection of bottles on the mantelpiece is now a monument to poor decisions. Ether, though cheap in small doses, becomes ruinously expensive when it's ordered by the crate. Several of London's best families have quietly begun selling off their heirlooms. A painting here, a second-best carriage there, anything to pay the bills before the creditors start knocking. The butlers are keeping a careful eye on the silverware. The housekeeper has noticed that Lady Blythe's pearls have vanished, and so has her memory of where she last left them. There is inevitably gossip. Society is whispering behind its gloved hands. It's not just about the ether anymore. It's about what happened while people were under its spell. Tales of scandal are multiplying. A dowager caught napping in the bishop's mitre. A future baronet found weeping over a wilted fern. And one memorable incident where Lord Redgrave tried to propose to a suit of armor. Every party has its price, and reputations are the first to be auctioned off. The family physician, once so enthusiastic, is now tight-lipped and weary. His patients are listless, irritable, and prone to mysterious rashes. He tries to taper them off the vapor, suggesting walks in the park and strong coffee. But the habit is a stubborn one. Some swear off ether entirely, vowing never to touch the stuff again, until the next rainy evening, when the lure of just one more medicinal dose proves too strong to resist. Even the servants, who are normally models of discretion, are finding their patience wearing thin. After weeks of chaos, they're dreaming of a house where guests faint only from boredom, and the family heirlooms are actually used for their intended purpose. The cook refuses to make syllabub ever again. The butler has banned handkerchiefs from the dining room, and the parlor maid is eyeing the ether decanter as if it might sprout legs and start trouble all on its own. So, as the ether clouds finally begin to lift, high society surveys the damage. There are bruised egos, empty purses, and a nagging sense that something has been lost. A little dignity, a lot of sleep, and perhaps the last illusion that progress comes without a price. But don't worry, it's not quite over yet. In true Victorian fashion, there's always room for one more round, one last toast, one more attempt to chase novelty before reality calls everyone home. For what is high society, if not stubbornly, spectacularly slow to learn? And what is an ether hangover, if not the universe's gentle reminder that even the loftiest salons can end up on the floor? Ether addiction wasn't just a social inconvenience. It became a full-blown medical crisis. As more upper-crust Victorians sought help, or were sent by their mortified families, doctors began to realize that not every problem could be solved with more ether. It starts with a discreet knock on the doctor's door. The patient arrives bundled in a carriage, hidden behind tinted glass and a veil of shame. The family doctor, who just 6 months earlier was singing the praises of these miracle vapors, now sits stone-faced behind his desk, reviewing case notes that are written in a mix of optimism and sheer panic. The symptoms: nervous exhaustion, absent-mindedness, and inability to remain upright at dinner parties. The diagnosis: high society in crisis. The rehabilitation process is predictably very Victorian. The patient isn't sent to a spa, but rather to a relative's country house, far from temptation and the scandalous gaze of London. The prescription is fresh air, brisk walks, and if the patient is very lucky, hot chocolate instead of ether. Family members take turns providing moral support, though many of them prefer to watch from a safe distance, wary of catching whatever affliction comes from too many evenings lost in chemical bliss. Withdrawal is not for the faint of heart. The body protests with headaches, chills, and inexplicable urges to weep into the curtains. Patients become irritable, restless, and prone to staring moodily out of windows, searching the horizon for a lost sense of euphoria. There are journals full of rambling self-reflection and tearful declarations that this time, truly, they are done with the vapor forever. Occasionally, someone attempts to barter with the gardener for a secret supply. The gardener, to his credit, just pretends not to hear. The doctor, once a champion of modern chemistry, now advocates for the healing power of routine. A strict schedule is imposed. Early mornings, hearty breakfasts, supervised walks, and absolutely no mysterious handkerchiefs at bedtime. If the patient can be kept occupied, preferably with healthy activities like sketching, fishing, or alphabetizing the family library, then so much the better. The mind, the doctor intones, must be restored to equilibrium. No one ever asks if the doctor's own equilibrium is holding up. Of course, there are relapses. The temptation returns during thunderstorms, on tedious afternoons, or when a well-meaning visitor brings a gift-wrapped medicinal tonic. The patient swears it's just for their nerves. Just a drop, just this once. The cycle repeats. The family members sigh. The doctor scribbles new notes. Patient attempted to extract ether from lamp oil. Intervention, brisk walk, stern lecture. And the cook wonders how much longer she'll have to hide the vanilla essence. By now, word has spread among London's elite. Too much ether, and you may find yourself taking the waters in Bath or being forced to endure a summer in the Scottish Highlands with your least favorite aunt. Rumors are circulating about secret asylums for nervous disorders, where the upper crust are reformed with a regimen of cold baths and moral essays. For most, the mere threat of being exiled to the countryside is motivation enough to at least pretend they're on the mend. Eventually, some do recover. The mind clears, the appetite returns, and the very sight of an ether bottle inspires only a vague sense of nausea. There are promises to never touch the stuff again, at least not until the next irresistible fad comes along. And so, the Victorian approach to rehab is revealed for what it really is: a mixture of medical guesswork, social pressure, and the eternal belief that absolutely everything can be cured by a change of scenery. One thing is certain: when the doctor will see you now, you're not getting ether. You're getting a long walk, a cup of tea, and a very pointed reminder that nothing is ever truly discreet in high society. Suddenly, all those rules about which forks to use and what to talk about seem less important when half your friends are face down on a divan. Victorian etiquette has finally met its match, and the result is a brand new kind of social chaos. For decades, etiquette books had been the very backbone of high society. They were weighty volumes detailing how to curtsy at precisely the right angle, where to place a lobster fork, and how to engage in conversation without ever mentioning bodily functions, strong emotions, or the existence of France. Hosts prided themselves on their impeccable manners, and guests lived in mortal terror of using the wrong spoon. Dignity, composure, and order were the currency of every good salon. But then came ether, and with it, the gentle collapse of every social rule that had ever been carved into mahogany. At first, the hosts did their best to maintain appearances. The invitations were still hand-written in perfect copper plate. The parlors were arranged with military precision. Sofa here, tea tray there, fainting couch just in case, discreetly tucked behind the aspidistra. Everyone arrived in their best gloves, and the opening conversation dutifully revolved around the weather, local politics, and how lovely Lady Elmsworth's begonias were this year. The trouble began with the handkerchiefs. At the first whiff of ether, polite conversation just wobbled and then collapsed. The Dowager Countess, a bastion of decorum, was soon discovered telling ghost stories to the butler. Lord Featherstone, who was normally incapable of laughter, was giggling at the antimacassars. Small talk about the Crimean War devolved into a heated debate about whether the dog could be taught to play the harpsichord. Protocol, which was once so comforting, just evaporated along with the vapor. Etiquette books never covered what to do if a guest faints onto the tea trolley, or how to politely wake someone who has fallen asleep in the umbrella stand. No chapter addressed the correct response to a poetry recital delivered while hanging upside down from the library ladder. The advice on avoiding scandal was largely silent on the issue of spontaneous charades involving the furniture. The staff did their best to preserve some sense of order. Maids quietly swept up broken teacups and removed unconscious guests to the music room for recuperation. But even they had to admit that the usual boundaries were dissolving. Servants who once never spoke above a whisper in company were now quietly wagering on which guest would be the first to try and converse with the goldfish. And then there were the apologies. The next morning, the most common activity in all of Mayfair was the writing of carefully phrased notes. So sorry for the incident with the pudding. Or my deepest apologies if I inadvertently recited Tennyson at the Potted Palms. Etiquette manuals were hastily amended, adding footnotes for unusual merriment and unexpected horizontal guests. For some, the collapse of this rigid social order was liberating. People discovered that they could survive an evening without following all the rules, and sometimes even enjoy themselves in the process. The salons grew noisier, laughter became a fixture, and the horror of public embarrassment faded as everyone realized that this time, nobody had managed to keep their dignity entirely intact. Of course, there were casualties. The family silver suffered, the carpets bore mysterious stains, and the reputation of certain matrons would never fully recover. But by the time the ether craze began to wane, the etiquette books were gathering dust, and the memory of those wild evenings had become the stuff of legend. In the end, it was clear that etiquette is no match for the law of unintended consequences, or for a society that is determined to chase novelty wherever it may lead, even if it's right under the fainting couch. Addiction has a price. Family fortunes shrink, inheritances evaporate, and that second home in Bath quietly gets sold. The only thing that's growing is your collection of empty bottles and regrets. In the heady early days, ether seemed harmless enough, a clever new amusement for the bored and the fashionable, a scientific party trick that cost less than a new hat and promised more excitement than yet another poetry reading. But as with all trends that sweep through the drawing rooms of the wealthy, the costs began to mount. At first, it was just a matter of a few extra pounds to the apothecary, a tip to the discreet chemist, or the price of another monogrammed ether flask for your collection. It was nothing the estate couldn't absorb. But fads, especially the intoxicating ones, never stay modest for long. What starts as an occasional indulgence turns into a weekly ritual, and then a daily necessity. Households that once prided themselves on their frugality now found themselves ordering ether by the crate. The apothecary's ledger swelled with aristocratic names, and some chemists began to offer discounts for their regular customers, which is always a bad sign. Even the butler, ever discreet, noticed that the liquor bills were down, but the ether bills had climbed alarmingly high. The financial impact crept in, as silent as a butler's footstep. Heirlooms once displayed with pride started to disappear. First to go was the silver tea service, temporarily pawned to pay off a lingering account. Then a family portrait was loaned to a distant cousin, never to return. By the time anyone noticed the missing candelabra, the money had already vanished. The drawing rooms were just as grand, but the underlying wealth had sprung a leak. Inheritance, that sacred Victorian institution, was suddenly less of a guarantee. The next generation, who once expected to inherit acres of rolling countryside, now found themselves the proud owners of little more than a few moth-eaten carpets and a mountain of unpaid bills. Letters were being sent to old friends, asking about business opportunities. Daughters who might have hoped for titled suitors were now quietly encouraged to consider anyone with a reliable income, even if he did something as vulgar as work. Social status, which is ever fragile, started to wobble. The most extravagant ether enthusiasts became cautionary tales, whispered about over weak tea. Did you hear about Lord Fenwick? He sold his favorite spaniel just to keep up with his apothecary. Debts were delicately described as temporary setbacks, and the annual trip to the continent was canceled in favor of some healthful country air. Meanwhile, the next ether party was somehow never in short supply. Reputation, too, is a form of currency, and it's just as easily spent. The gossip sheets thrived on stories of formerly wealthy families who were brought low by their own excess. Ether ruins a viscount, screamed the headlines. Dinner invitations began to dry up for the most notorious offenders, and new faces started to appear at parties. Upstart industrialists with suspiciously full wallets and not a whiff of vapor about them. There were those who managed to weather the storm, who pulled back from the brink and saved the family name, usually by disposing of the last few bottles and sending certain relatives abroad for their nerves. But for many, the slide was unstoppable. Wealth that had been built over generations dissolved in a single season of fashionable indulgence. The only reminders left were the empty flasks tucked away in drawers, the faded invitations to parties that could no longer be thrown, and the lingering memory of a time when Ruin wore silk gloves and everyone just agreed to look the other way. For the ether generation, the greatest hangover wasn't just in the head, but in the accounts. a legacy of loss, a lesson in excess, and a cautionary tale written in disappearing ink. Not everyone saw ether as a disaster. Some of the era's greatest writers and painters swore it helped them see new worlds. Of course, they were also seeing dancing raccoons in the wallpaper, but that's just inspiration. In a time when nearly every respectable Victorian household boasted at least one poet and a fainting couch, it was only a matter of time before ether leaped from the drawing room to the garret studio. Suddenly, the creative types, those who had always looked a little dazed anyway, found themselves in possession of a new muse, delivered in a tiny glass bottle. The effect was immediate. Journals filled up with wild sketches, poems were written in the margins of cookbooks, and at least one unfinished symphony was composed entirely on the triangle. Take, for example, the case of Percy Marshwood, a minor painter with a major collection of empty bottles. Marshwood's reputation for gloomy landscapes was eclipsed overnight by a sudden burst of ether-induced productivity. Friends who visited his studio were treated to enormous canvases of clouds shaped like mythological beasts, and a controversial self-portrait that critics described as both alarming and strangely upside down. Marshwood insisted that the clouds spoke to him, and that he was simply documenting their side of the conversation. Writers, too, embraced the vapor. Society's most fashionable salons were soon hosting ether evenings, where aspiring poets would compete to recite their latest verses before the vapor wore off. The results were mixed. Some verses soared to previously unimagined heights of feeling and imagery. Others consisted of nothing but the phrase, "I am a turnip," repeated for 12 stanzas. The audiences, who were equally inspired or perhaps equally confused, applauded everything with the same enthusiasm. Among novelists, ether was rumored to be the secret behind a new wave of wildly imaginative fiction. Plots twisted in impossible directions. Characters would change species mid-chapter, and at least one heroine rode off into the sunset on a giant talking cabbage. Publishers, who were initially baffled, began marketing these books as adventures in the new literary etherism. Sales boomed. The critics, out of self-preservation, simply called it modern. Of course, not all artistic efforts ended in triumph. The composer Geraldine Nash, after an evening spent communing with her metronome, declared that she had written the music of the spheres. When it was performed, the piece was described by the audience as bracing, confusing, and an effective alarm for pets. Sculptors claimed that ether helped them see the shapes that were hidden within the marble, though one regrettable bust was later discovered to be just an accidentally glued pile of egg cups. Critics and society alike were divided. Some declared ether a divine gift to creativity, something that opened the mind's eye and freed the spirit from the dreariness of daily life. Others pointed out that, historically, most masterpieces had been produced on little more than strong tea and a severe lack of sleep. Letters to the Times alternated between praise for the daring genius of our ether-inspired artists and complaints that Too many novels now featured talking wallpaper. Inevitably, as with all things Victorian, the fashion burned brightly but briefly. Soon enough, the salons returned to safer amusements, and the ether bottles migrated back to the medicine cabinets or were quietly buried in the garden. The artists who survived the era did so with stories, some embarrassing, some dazzling, all of them vivid. But for a brief, swirling moment, the world was stranger, the art was bolder, and inspiration was just a sniff away. Ether may have faded from the studio, but the memory lingers, as do a few unfinished canvases and the immortal line, "My darling, I swear the wallpaper just winked at me." Once the doctors sobered up, the warnings began. Medical journals filled up with horror stories, and Parliament started muttering about regulation. The age of carefree sniffing was coming to an end. At first, the backlash was gentle. It was little more than a cautionary note slipped into the back of the Lancet. Cases of ether excess have been observed, the report read, in that understated medical tone that makes everything sound vaguely like a gardening accident. Society mostly ignored these hints, being too busy worrying about waistcoat buttons and whether the cook had been skimping on the anchovy paste. But the incidents kept piling up. There were fainting spells in public gardens, reports of minor explosions involving ether and ill-placed gas lamps, and a disturbing increase in people who were convinced that the family tortoise was reciting Shakespeare. When Lord Derby was found sleepwalking down Pall Mall in nothing but a cravat, the matter could no longer be brushed aside. Suddenly, every house in London was buzzing with anxious speculation. Is ether safe? Should it be kept away from children, the elderly, and anyone who has ever tried to make toast using only a fireplace poker? The medical establishment, never keen on admitting a collective blunder, swung into action. Eminent physicians, many of whom had once cheerfully prescribed ether for everything from sore throats to marital boredom, were now penning furious letters to the editor. Ether, a menace to moral and physical health, declared one. The perils of vaporous amusement warned another. Society physicians began to distance themselves, assuring their worried clients that their own ether was strictly medicinal, and that Lady Farquhar's incident with the window box had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Parliament, always eager to be seen as protecting the public, especially when elections were near, waded in. There were debates, heated and lengthy, about the threat that was posed by chemical amusements. Committees were formed. Questions were asked. Might ether, one MP inquired, undermine the moral backbone of the empire? No one knew for certain, but everyone agreed that something had to be done. The idea of a tax on ether was floated, then dropped when someone pointed out the nation's reliance on nervous tonics during parliamentary sessions. Meanwhile, the newspapers, having just finished fueling the craze, switched sides with breathtaking speed. Case studies filled the columns. Lady Harrington, once a picture of poise, was now unable to attend dinner parties without being gently propped up against the sideboard. Cartoonists drew society matrons in a cloud of vapor, chasing their own hats through Hyde Park. Even the penny dreadfuls got in on the act, describing wild scenes of vapor-induced mayhem and promising that tonight's installment contained 3 actual medical opinions and a chase scene involving a startled bishop. Households, newly alarmed, began locking away their bottles and eyeing any guest who sniffed a little too enthusiastically at the centerpiece. The apothecaries, now the target of muttered accusations and nervous glances, quietly removed their most flamboyant displays. Even the most stalwart ether fans began to reconsider, especially when reminded that Queen Victoria herself had reportedly switched to smelling salts by royal decree. In a matter of weeks, the public mood had changed completely. What was once a harmless amusement had become a sign of recklessness, or worse, social decline. The parties dwindled. The invitations grew vague. The ether craze, once so unstoppable, now faded away under a cloud of suspicion, shame, and the faint smell of disinfectant. But if Victorian society was quick to panic, it was also quick to forget. Soon, some new novelty would sweep the city, and ether would be relegated to that long, colorful list of unfortunate but instructive fads. Until then, Londoners nursed their hangovers, counted their fingers, and congratulated themselves on surviving yet another chapter in the never-ending saga of public health panics. Ether addiction may have faded, but the search for the next fashionable fix never stopped. Soon, Victorians were lining up for cocaine tooth drops, laudanum tonics, and whatever else promised to numb the existential dread of being really rich and really bored. As the ether craze fizzled out, snuffed by scandal, regulation, and the lingering scent of burnt upholstery, the great machine of Victorian novelty spun on, completely undeterred. The city's chemists, always quick to adapt, swapped their ether bottles for new marvels. Laudanum, a potent tincture of opium, was suddenly the must-have for headaches, heartbreak, and inconveniently long sermons. Housewives dabbed it behind their ears before dinner parties. Poets swore by it. Even the family dog, if unlucky enough to catch a cold, might end up with a dose. Not to be outdone, the pharmaceutical world rolled out a dizzying parade of bottled solutions for all of life's many woes. Cocaine tooth drops for teething infants. Why not? They were recommended by the Queen's own dentist, no less. Just a dab on the gum, the adverts chirped, and Junior will smile for hours. Children's cough syrups were laced with morphine. Nerve tonics promised instant relief for hysteria, lassitude, or ennui. There was even Vin Mariani, a fortified wine that was spiked with coca leaves, championed by popes, writers, and anyone who fancied feeling both blessed and bulletproof. The Victorians just loved a quick fix, especially when it came in a handsome bottle with a gold-embossed label. Doctors who were eager to keep pace with the times and their profits became enthusiastic pitchmen. Newspapers were filled with glowing testimonial from satisfied customers. No longer does my husband weep at the sight of boiled mutton, or since taking Mrs. Pettigrew's invigorating cordial. My mother-in-law is almost tolerable. It's hard to tell where the advertising ended and the social experiment began. The social scene adjusted seamlessly. Ether parties gave way to laudanum picnics and medicinal wine tastings. Hosts would hire pianists to play dreamy sonatas while their guests reclined on cushions, passing around little bottles and exchanging tips on how best to disguise the bitter aftertaste. New etiquette dilemmas arose. Was it polite to bring your own opium pipe to a dinner party? How many drops of tonic were too many before attempting the quadrille? And what exactly should one say to a guest who had mistaken the umbrella stand for a confidant? Of course, the problems persisted, just with new packaging. The medical journals, ever reactive, were soon filled with new warnings. There were anxious debates about cough syrup dependency, the excessive use of invigorating stimulants, and peculiar behaviors at the Poetry Society. Parliament, somewhat sheepishly, considered new regulations. Chemists quietly removed the most colorful elixirs from their front displays, moving them to a back shelf labeled for special customers only. But the thirst for distraction was impossible to quench. The next trend was always just over the horizon. Some claimed to have discovered the health benefits of electricity, mild shocks to invigorate the mind. Others extolled the virtues of mineral waters, sea air, or daily ice baths. There were diets involving little more than watercress and hope. There were spiritualists, mesmerists, and doctors who prescribed vigorous calisthenics while standing on your head. Yet for all these medical marvels, nothing quite recaptured the giddy chaos of the ether era. The thrill of not knowing what might happen next, the delicious absurdity of high society coming utterly unmoored, was unique. It was a perfect storm of wealth, curiosity, and just enough denial to keep everyone coming back for more. So the Victorians moved on, always seeking, always sampling, never quite satisfied. And as new fads blossomed and faded, one truth remained. History's greatest addiction is to novelty itself. The legacy of the ether craze still lingers, half cautionary tale, half comedy of errors. Every time someone invents a new wellness trend or a miracle cure, you can thank the Victorians for blazing the trail with style, absurdity, and a total lack of safety protocols. You can still feel its faint presence in the way we all talk about health and happiness. Scientific advances, miracle remedies, and breakthrough solutions, all phrases that the Victorians adored. They may have swapped vapor for vitamin supplements and electrotherapy for cold plunges, but the urge is unchanged. It's a longing for something to fix life's persistent annoyances. Ether is gone from the drawing rooms, but its ghost still wanders the shelves of modern pharmacies, peeking out from under the collagen gummies and the detox teas. Stories from the era have taken on a mythic glow. Some say that ether fueled a golden age of creativity, while others insist it was nothing but trouble. If you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers at society dinners, tales of poets who claimed the vapor opened their minds to new universes, or of aristocrats who woke up convinced they had danced all night with a herd of invisible giraffes. Like all the best historical disasters, the facts have blurred into legend, each retelling a little more dramatic and a little less plausible. Modern lessons abound, if you care to look for them. The first, and perhaps the simplest, is this: human beings will do almost anything to escape boredom, even if it involves inhaling something that smells like burnt licorice and leaves, you convinced that your best friend is a potted fern. Progress, it turns out, is a double-edged sword. The same curiosity that leads to medical breakthroughs also leads to rooms full of very expensive people crawling under tables looking for inspiration. Then there's the question of trust, particularly trust in science, in doctors, and in whatever the neighbor swears is the next big thing. The Victorians learned the hard way that expertise is not always the same as wisdom. For every life-saving advance, there was a parade of questionable advice, usually delivered by a man with wild hair and a certificate from a university no one had ever heard of. Ether's story is a reminder to ask not just, does it work? But also, what could possibly go wrong? The social angle is equally instructive. Ether's popularity spread through drawing rooms, dinner parties, and the irresistible power of groupthink. If the Duchess tried it, then so did everyone else. A generation later, nothing has really changed. Trends still sweep through society, propelled by curiosity, envy, and the sheer thrill of just joining in. Whether it's a Victorian vapor or a 21st century juice cleanse, the herd instinct is alive and well. But maybe the greatest lesson of all is this: no matter how absurd things get, people have an astonishing capacity to adapt, recover, and eventually laugh at their own disasters. The salons that once overflowed with ether-induced chaos eventually settled back into order. The reputation of the silverware recovered, mostly. Even the most embarrassing tailies became fodder for dinner parties, softened by time and retelling. So the next time you see a new wellness trend taking off, just remember the Victorians. Remember their optimism, their spectacular blunders, and the lingering ghost of ether, forever haunting the margins of every miracle cure. If history teaches us anything, it's that we are rarely as wise as we hope to be, but we're usually a lot more entertaining than we intend. And somewhere behind the curtain, there's still a faint whiff of vapor, just waiting for the next brave soul to take a sniff and start the whole comedy all over again. As the ether clouds finally fade and the party winds down, you find yourself grateful for fresh air, a sturdy mattress, and the fact that modern medicine now comes with warning labels. But somewhere, a distant echo of laughter reminds you that history's most ridiculous disasters always make the best bedtime stories. It's late in Victorian London. The carriages have all rattled away, leaving behind a trail of muddled memories and the faint scent of burnt lace. The great houses are quiet again. There's just the tick of clocks, the creak of floorboards, and perhaps the gentle snore of a baronet who hasn't quite made it home to his own bed yet. Downstairs, the servants are tidying up the last traces of mayhem. Empty bottles are tucked away. Spilled punch is quietly mopped from the Turkish rug, and ether-soaked handkerchiefs are hung out to dry in the crisp night air. You, a survivor of the era's most fashionable chaos, are finally alone in your chamber. The mattress sags a little. The fire is flickering low, and outside the window, a pale mist is rising off the city. You breathe deeply, just plain oxygen with no special additives. Your mind drifts back to the absurdities of the night. Uncles who mistook the lampshade for a helmet. A dowager countess who swore her corset could sing. And that persistent rumor about the Queen's footman reciting Latin to the goldfish. Victorian sleep, much like Victorian life, is a mixed blessing. The beds are softer than a stone floor, but only just. Your pillow is filled with feathers, or possibly the family goose. The nightgown is scratchy, but at least it's yours. For once, you're blissfully free of vapor, of scandal, and of anyone threatening to read you their experimental poetry. Outside, the city finally grows quiet. No more clinking glasses or spontaneous outbursts of the polka. You close your eyes, letting the day's noise just ebb away. Maybe your heart is still pounding from too much laughter, or from trying to escape the attentions of an ether-inspired suitor. But here, in the quiet dark, you have time to reflect on how strange people can be, on the fads that rise and fall, and on the simple miracle of an uneventful night. If you listen closely, you can hear the slow, collective sigh of a society that's exhausted by its own inventiveness. Upstairs, the family dreams of better times and more sensible hobbies. Downstairs, the staff dreams of a week without any chemical spills. Even the cat, curled up by the hearth, finally relaxes, safe from swooning guests and the occasional airborne canapé. And so you tuck yourself in and give thanks for the lamp that glows without an open flame, for the tea that doesn't require a prescription, and for the knowledge that, at least tonight, your greatest risk is a slightly cold foot, not an accidental explosion. In a world that's still wobbling between progress and folly, the chance to simply rest feels like the ultimate luxury. As you drift off, the shadows on the wall settle into ordinary shapes, and the memories of Victorian excess turn soft and distant, like stories told in the glow of a dying fire. Tomorrow, the world will invent new troubles and fresh amusements. But tonight, you are safe, blanketed in quiet, and watched over by the ghosts of 1,000 well-intentioned disasters. Sleep tight, don't sniff the vapors, and may your dreams be free of both fainting couches and impromptu science experiments. Because the past may be strange, but at least bedtime is still mostly sacred. It's opening night at the Royal Opera, and every noble in London is squeezed into boxes that are tighter than their waistcoats. But instead of swooning at the soprano, everyone's clutching lace handkerchiefs that have been doused in ether. By intermission, half the audience is giggling at the chandeliers. The conductor has forgotten which opera they're performing, and at least one duke is convinced that the second act is a personal hallucination. Just picture the scene. London's cultural elite, dressed in shimmering silk and velvet, are parading up the marble steps with all the solemnity of a royal funeral. The opera house is ablaze with gaslight, the air thick with expensive perfume, and the rustle of programs printed on paper so fine it could probably serve as a dinner roll in a pinch. A hush falls as the curtain rises. The prima donna appears, her voice soaring to the rafters, but everyone's attention is wavering, because tonight something new is stealing the show. Word has spread among the cognoscenti. Ether is the must-have accessory of the season. Its effects are said to make any experience transcendent, which, for the opera, is considered both a promise and a threat. By the time the overture begins, half the crowd is already partaking. Delicate sniffles are echoing through the gallery as lace handkerchiefs flutter from box to box, more contagious than any yawn or cough. It doesn't take long for decorum to completely dissolve. The baritone's aria is interrupted by fits of laughter from a box that's usually reserved for judges. In the stalls, a viscount whispers that he can actually see the music, and he spends most of the act staring intently at the violin section. Across the aisle, Lady Penelope is so taken with the color of the curtains that she misses an entire duet. The orchestra bravely carries on, even as one of the cellists succumbs to an uncontrollable case of the giggles. Backstage, word of the audience's altered state spreads quickly. The soprano, convinced her performance has never been more inspired, receives applause that is so thunderous and oddly timed that she suspects a second encore might require a medical team. The tenor, always quick to seize on a trend, requests a discreet sniff before the final act, reasoning that if the critics are incapacitated, no review could possibly be bad. By intermission, chaos reigns. The grand foyer, which is meant for genteel conversation and discreet flirting, is now a carnival of confusion. A duke is attempting to order oysters from a statue. The matron of a prominent family is seen debating philosophy with the coat rack. Footmen are ferrying smelling salts and strong tea through the crowd, but it's no use. Ether has turned London's most dignified night out into a gently swirling masquerade of complete nonsense. Meanwhile, the opera management is at its wit's end. The manager contemplates adding a new warning to the program. Please refrain from vaporous indulgence during dramatic arias. The ushers are doing their best to keep order, gently waking those who have drifted off mid-quartet and encouraging patrons to clap only when the music has actually ended. But tradition has surrendered to the trend. When the final curtain falls, it does so to a standing ovation, a feat that's achieved mostly because no one can remember whether they're supposed to sit or stand. The critics stagger home, their reviews full of poetic confusion. Never before has Ada seemed so perpendicular. Rumors of the night's debauchery travel swiftly, and the opera house secures its place in the annals of both high culture and just being high. And so, the opera house incident goes down in history. It's a cautionary tale for the ages, a masterclass in what happens when ether and elegance collide, and proof that even the finest arts are no match for the absurdity of human curiosity. Victorian clubs were all about exclusivity until someone started an ether appreciation society with weekly meetings, questionable snacks, and a sign-up sheet for experimental volunteers. Doctors gave lectures between fits of giggles, while respectable matrons tried to decide whether the side effects included sudden ballroom dancing. Spoiler alert, they did. It began innocently enough, in the smoky back rooms of London's most prestigious gentlemen's clubs, the Athenaeum, the Reform, even the stuffy Travellers' Club. These were places where members usually argued about parliamentary procedure and the relative merits of snipe shooting. But with the ether craze in full swing, a few forward thinkers decided it was time for a more progressive sort of gathering. And so the ether-sniffing society was born. Membership was by invitation only, though in practice, a well-timed anecdote about one's last ether experience was the fastest way in. The rules were simple. Bring your own handkerchief. Don't set fire to the upholstery. And try to remain vertical, at least until the first lecture had concluded. Meetings took place in a haze of cigar smoke and competitive, nervous laughter. Bowls of questionable snacks, pickled walnuts, anchovy biscuits, and a mysterious cheese from the continent were on hand for those with a strong constitution. Each gathering featured a guest speaker, usually a doctor or a chemist who claimed to have studied the effects of ether extensively, though their research notes were often suspiciously wine-stained and smelled faintly of vapor. They presented their findings with the solemnity of a parliamentary debate, pausing only for dramatic sniffing breaks. One memorable evening featured Dr. Ambrose Snell, who argued mid-giggle that ether was the very cornerstone of modern social advancement. Half the audience agreed. The other half forgot what the topic was and spent the rest of the night counting the ceiling tiles. The society wasn't just limited to men. In time, it became so fashionable that even the most proper matrons insisted on attending, chaperoned, of course, by their most responsible niece or an unimpressed clergyman. The result was a uniquely Victorian blend of scientific inquiry and unchecked silliness. One matron, Lady Duckworth, famously declared after her second dose that she could now see the future, and that it involved far fewer corsets. Experiments, such as they were conducted with great ceremony. Some members claimed to have unlocked the secrets of the universe. Others merely developed a strong attachment to the club's stuffed owl mascot. There were attempts to measure the duration and quality of the ether-induced euphoria, but the only consistent finding was that it made people unusually interested in reciting Latin, arm wrestling, or debating whether the room was spinning clockwise or anti-clockwise. Of course, not all went according to plan. One disastrous meeting ended with the club president getting stuck halfway out a window, convinced he was auditioning for the opera. Another evening saw the society banned from the Reform Club for excessive merriment and unlicensed cartwheeling. Rumor had it that several prominent members' wives, after investigating, returned home with the firm conviction that men could not be left alone with either ether or cheese for more than half an hour. As word spread, copycat societies popped up all over town, each one vying for the title of most enlightened or, failing that, least likely to be prosecuted for public disturbance. Eventually, the ether-sniffing society faded away with the fad. But the memory lingered, alongside a few scorch marks on the carpet and a collective sense of awe at how quickly science could go sideways in the wrong company. In the end, the society stands as a monument to Victorian ambition and eccentricity. It's proof that no matter how exclusive the club, you're only ever a whiff away from glorious nonsense. Getting your portrait painted used to mean hours of sitting absolutely motionless. Then came ether, the new relaxant. Suddenly, society portraitists were fielding commissions from clients who couldn't keep their eyes open and would occasionally fall out of their chairs mid-pose. The results. Let's just say that the 1850s were a golden age for half-finished faces and accidental cubism. Just imagine it. You're in the grand, drafty studio of a fashionable painter. Sunlight is filtering through the grimy windows, picking out clouds of turpentine and anticipation. The artist, all wild hair and a smudged waistcoat, flourishes his brushes. You, dressed in your best satin or starch, settle onto the posing chair, a throne of pure discomfort. Hold perfectly still, the painter commands. Try to look both dignified and thoughtful. You nod. Your spine protests. The clock ticks. The tea goes cold. For generations, these portrait sessions were a feat of endurance. Models would practice meditative breathing. They'd daydream about dinner, or they'd try to transcend their aching muscles. One misplaced twitch, and the artist would sigh, repaint, or, if you were unlucky, start all over again entirely. It was a trial by boredom, with a prize of immortality and sometimes a suspiciously long nose. But then ether entered the scene. No longer was stillness a torment. It was a side effect. Society, ever eager for an easier route to posterity, embraced the relaxant with open arms. Sitters would arrive with their handkerchiefs discreetly scented, confident that they could just breeze through the ordeal. Portraitists who were initially skeptical quickly adapted. If the client snored, well, that was simply a new kind of artistic repose. Ether completely transformed the experience. Some subjects became so tranquil they nearly merged with the furniture, staring off into space with expressions of blissful confusion. The artist would occasionally have to prod a patron awake, hopping to finish the eyes before their subject drifted entirely out of the frame. Lord Fitzwilliam's portrait became famous for its dreamy gaze. The rumor was that he was pondering the nature of existence, but in reality, he'd just forgotten his own name. Of course, mishaps abounded. Some etherized clients, moments before the crucial sitting, would suddenly erupt in giggles, lose all sense of balance, or just slide from their chair in slow motion. Children brought in to be immortalized for the family posterity would grow as limp as rag dolls and had to be propped up with cushions and a helpful maid standing just out of view. At least one portrait session ended with the sitter facing entirely the wrong direction, producing a thoughtful rear view that critics praised as boldly modern. The trend even reached the heights of artistic fashion. Society pages breathlessly reported on the new serenity that was being seen in the faces of London's elite. Such composure, gushed one review. Such innovative use of drool. Portraitists, emboldened by the demand, started experimenting with softer lines and vaguer backgrounds, just in case their subject wobbled or faded away mid-pose. But beneath all the novelty, not everyone was pleased. A few old-school artists grumbled that true character could not be captured through chemistry. A portrait must reveal the soul, one of them declared, not just a relaxed jawline. Family matriarchs worried that children who were immortalized under the influence might appear a little too cheerful, or, even worse, slightly cross-eyed. Rumors spread that the Queen herself had banned the practice in royal sittings, although several of the courtiers' paintings seemed suspiciously dreamy. Inevitably, like all fads, the ether portrait craze faded. Artists quietly went back to demanding stillness and patience. Clients resumed their stoic suffering, and everyone agreed not to mention the unfortunate Floating Earl series. Still, a few dreamy, gently lopsided portraits remain, a testament to the age when a little vapor promised beauty, ease, and, for once, the art of not minding the weight. All good things and all disastrous vices must come to an end. One foggy week, the city's ether supply runs dangerously low. Socialites begin to panic. Fights are breaking out at the apothecary. Black market bottles are being circulated in silk handbags. Desperate nobles are sending their footmen on midnight errands. And rumors are swirling that the Duchess of Roxburgh has started sniffing turpentine just to take the edge off. It begins with a single, innocent phrase uttered by a distracted chemist. "I'm afraid we're out of ether, madam." At first, society doesn't quite register the significance. After all, shortages happen. There was the great ice cream famine of 43 and the tragic gin drought of 39. But ether, surely such a modern marvel would flow forever. Yet, as the days pass, anxious whispers are rippling through London's parlors and ballrooms. The apothecaries are besieged. Well-dressed customers are queuing before dawn, clutching empty flasks and ever more creative stories of their medical need. The chemists, faced with a stampede of anxious clients, begin rationing what little stock remains. An ounce for Lady Thornton's nerves, half a dram for the vicar's spiritual exercises. When word gets out that supplies are running low, tempers flare. Lady Jessup, normally the very soul of composure, is spotted wrestling a rival for the last bottle, her ostrich plume feather askew and her dignity nowhere to be seen. Desperation breeds innovation. Resourceful butlers strike up covert deals with understocked dispensaries, while enterprising footmen are dispatched on midnight scavenger hunts. The black market booms. Unlabeled bottles are sold in shadowy corners, with the sellers swearing it's the real thing and not just gin mixed with eucalyptus. Scented handkerchiefs are guarded more closely than family heirlooms. Lady Pembleton even installs a lockbox for her vapor supplies, which is guarded by a pug with an unusually fierce bark. The parties take on a frantic new edge. The old etiquette of first come, first served gives way to thinly veiled subterfuge. Guests arrive early, hopping to stake a claim, and they keep a weary eye on the decanter. Hosts attempt to water down the vapor with rose water or cologne, but the results are dismal, and the complaints are legendary. Sir Bernard attempts to concoct his own substitute, which results in a house full of sneezing guests and a parlor that smells of menthol for weeks. As the crisis drags on, the city's mood sours. Rumors are swirling. Did the Duchess of Roxburgh truly resort to sniffing turpentine? Is the prince consort hoarding ether down in the palace cellars? And who exactly is the mysterious vapor king now seen loitering outside the opera house, offering small vials to desperate debutantes? The newspapers have a field day, publishing helpful tips like breathing deeply, a safe alternative, and warning of a rise in accidental inhalations of lamp oil. The creative classes, robbed of their inspiration, declare a citywide malaise. No new poetry is being written. Artists are gazing blankly at their canvases. One famously melancholic playwright refuses to get out of bed, sending notes by footmen that say, "No vapor, no Hamlet." Society, unmoored from its favorite vice, tries to fill the void with tea card games, and in one ill-fated instance, a revival of interpretive dance. Just as the panic threatens to become permanent, a new shipment arrives from the continent. The crisis ends as suddenly as it began. Ether is rationed at first, then flows freely once more. London's parlors are filled with laughter, music, and a profound sense of relief. The shortage is remembered as both a trauma and a farce, fuel for gossip, for plays, and for one particularly memorable masquerade ball in which the entire theme was survival of the wittiest. The great ether shortage becomes a legend. It's proof that society, when deprived of its comforts, can be both ingenious and absolutely ridiculous. The authorities have had enough. Parliament is debating, doctors are weeping, and a coalition of mothers is marching on Westminster, waving pamphlets and empty vials. As new laws loom, the die-hard ether crowd throws one last delirious bash, complete with a secret knock, coded invitations, and a string quartet valiantly playing through clouds of chemical vapors. By sunrise, the era is over, but the stories are just getting started. It begins with a whisper in the House of Commons, regulation. At first, society barely notices. Parliament has threatened to ban everything from seditious pamphlets to overly enthusiastic bagpipes, after all. But this time, the mood is different. Doctors are publishing alarming studies. The Times is running editorials titled, "Is Civilization in Danger?" Moral reformers are thundering from the pulpit. Even Queen Victoria's corgis look weary. The writing is on the wall, and it smells faintly of medicinal vapor. The news spreads like spilled punch at a garden party. Invitations to ether gatherings become more clandestine, passed with a wink and a flourish. The city's best hostesses are vying for the honor of holding the last true ether frolic, each one trying to outdo the next with more elaborate themes, costumed footmen, and tableaux vivants featuring local poets who may or may not have any idea where they are. Entry is by password only, herbal infusion, and the guests are whispering about a secret contest. Who will be the last to faint? Inside these vanishing salons, the atmosphere is bittersweet, a wild mix of nostalgia, bravado, and gallows humor. Some guests swear they'll never give up their handkerchiefs, even if it means smuggling them to the continent. Others, more pragmatic, are tucking in for a final round of revelry, determined to make it one for the history books. Ether is being rationed, cherished, and in one memorable incident, auctioned off in exchange for a priceless snuff box and a signed portrait of Lord Byron's footman. The musicians are doing their best, playing waltzes that grow ever more surreal as the vapor thickens. Poets are improvising ode to lost evenings and forgotten names. Old feuds are patched up, old scandals are revived, and one gentleman attempts a passionate declaration of love to a potted palm. Even the family dog is dressed for the occasion, resplendent in a borrowed cravat and monocle. Outside, the world is changing quickly. Parliament passes the ban with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of finger-wagging. Chemists remove ether from their shelves. Doctors lock their cabinets. Police raids are making headlines. There are tailies of last-minute dashes to Paris, coded telegrams, and the black market's brief, spectacular boom. The city's ether elite, so recently at the center of fashion, now find themselves as relics overnight, exiled to the footnotes of polite society. But as with all great finales, there is both loss and laughter. Ether, for all its chaos, gave a generation stories they would tell for years to come. The legend of the last ether ball grows with every single retelling. A chandelier being swung on by a viscount, a duchess who recited the Iliad backwards, and a butler who, for one glorious moment, conducted the orchestra using only his eyebrows. And when the sun finally rises over a quieter, cleaner London, the last of the vapor drifts away, replaced by tea, sobriety, and the odd pang of nostalgia. High society straightens its gloves, repairs its reputations, and prepares for whatever madness comes next. The final curtain falls, not with a crash but with a sigh, a giggle, and the soft rustle of silk as the aristocrats of old learn, at last, to face the morning without a chemical crutch. Ether is gone, but its story lingers. A wisp of rebellion, a cautionary tale, and an unintentional comedy for the ages. So tonight, as you drift off in your clean bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of electricity and absolutely zero vaporized party drugs, just take a slow, grateful breath. Spare a moment for the ancestors who survived centuries of medical fads, social disasters, and whatever passed for wellness in the age of the corset. Remember, history's most fashionable disasters were just people. People who were bored, curious, and sometimes a little too eager to trust a glass bottle that was handed to them at a party. You've survived an evening in the heart of Victorian high society. You've watched the finest minds of the age pass out in parlors, and you've seen fortunes vanish faster than a sniff at a masquerade. You've witnessed the dignity of the upper class dissolve into giggles, confusion, and occasionally spontaneous waltzing with the curtains, all in the name of keeping up with the latest trend, and all while pretending that nothing out of the ordinary was happening at all. But through all the scented fog and the accidental arson, there's something stubbornly impressive about it. The resilience of people just trying to feel a little less alone, a little more alive, even if it meant making a complete mess of things in the process. The Victorians may have lost their grip on sobriety, on etiquette, and on common sense, but not on their flair for drama. So, as you tuck yourself in tonight, let yourself be quietly thankful for modern medicine, for safety labels, and for the miracle of waking up tomorrow with all of your dignity and your eyebrows still intact. The people of the past may have been outrageous, confused, and deeply misguided, but they were also endlessly inventive, and let's be honest, kind of hilarious. Because history isn't just a record of suffering or triumph. It's proof that people are stubborn, hopeful, and above all, gloriously ridiculous. Good night. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of both fainting couches and spontaneous Victorian raves.